Thanks, everybody. And then with this number of folks on the call, if you could just stay muted, that'd be wonderful. And then toward the end, when we have Q&A, we might ask you to unmute and ask a question, or actually the easiest thing to do is just to put that question in the chat, and I'll moderate that and ask the questions to our panelists. So with that, before we dive in, there's also a kind of a special announcement that I wanted to make before passing the baton off to Meghan here. And that is, we have the privilege of having Alec Underwood, who is WOC's new program director, on the call. This is really Alec's second week in the office. And so Alec, if you just want to wave or say something real quick, I'd love to say hello to the group here, and really excited that you're here.
Sure. Thanks, John. Can you hear me all right?
Loud and clear.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. Alec Underwood, new program director, as John mentioned. I'm really excited to be in Wyoming. I had the privilege of spending the last 12 years in Montana working on conservation issues, and even issues as we're talking about today, the BLM's proposed public lands rule. So really look forward to working with the WOC team, including all the program staff, John, Meghan, Yufna, Era's on here. They're a high functioning crew, so I have a lot to learn. And thanks, John. I'll pass it back to you.
Wonderful, Alec. So glad you're here. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the baton off to Meghan Riley here, who's going to get us kicked off with a presentation that she has on the BLM's Conservation Landscape Health Rule. So Meghan, it's all you.
Thanks so much, John. All right, I am going to see if I can start sharing my screen with you all. I have a few slides, so you have something fun to look at while I'm talking. And I'm sharing my screen, so I think I can enter the slideshow. All right, hope you can all see that fine. As John mentioned, we're here today to talk about BLM's draft conservation and landscape health rule that they have out for public comment right now. And I'm going to start by just giving a bit of an overview of why the rule is out for public comment and what it all entails. So just wanted to start with sort of the legislative hierarchy of the different sort of things that give government's power to do land management. So at the top of the pyramid, we have laws, followed by regulations, policy, and guidelines and codes. So of course, as many of you know, and Yufna is going to talk about this a little bit later, the Bureau of Land Management gets their authority to manage lands and their multiple use mandate from Congress. Congress passed the Federal Land Policy and Management Act in 1976. So that law gives the BLM its mandate to manage lands. What we're talking about today is a regulation or a rule. This is where the agency itself comes up with rules of how they're going to carry out their mission or their mandate. And so this conservation and landscape health rule, it's a draft right now, and it would just help the agency fulfill their mission. And why make a rule right now? So this rule aims to address some gaps in that FLPMA Act that we talked about, because what FLPMA does is Congress gave the BLM direction on what their mandate is, but not the how on how to implement it. So by addressing gaps in FLPMA, this rule could help clarify how the BLM implements their multi-use mandate, how the BLM can ensure sustained yields, and it would also hopefully improve balance between the multiple uses that BLM is managing for. And there's also a push for a new rule right now because BLM lands are facing new pressures right now. From climate change, we have increasing drought, increasing wildfire, and of course, there's been degradation in landscape health due to these effects from climate change and even development pressures. So there's a lot of good reasons to put out a new rule right now. And we were talking about this multiple use mandate that the BLM has under FLPMA, and I just wanted to run through some of these so that you get a sense of the fact that the BLM has to balance the needs of a lot of multiple uses and sustained yield, and that can be hard given all the different demands on these lands. So you have oil and gas on BLM lands, there's coal extraction, non-energy minerals are being mined on BLM lands. We have geothermal, wind, and solar energy that can be developed on BLM lands. Of course, recreation, those of us who live in Wyoming spend a lot of time recreating on our public lands, including on BLM lands. There's grazing on BLM lands, and not so much in Wyoming, but there is some timber. And just so you know, these numbers come from fiscal year 2020 for the entire nation. But Wyoming does have all of that going on BLM lands. But in addition to these multiple uses that are making money directly, we have all of these other values on the landscape that are also really important and uses that we want to manage for, such as water, wildlife, plant life, cultural sites, and scientific research. So there's a lot that the agency is trying to balance. And historically, some of these money generating uses have gotten a little bit more attention in management decisions, and some of these conservation values may have fallen by the wayside. So the intent of this rule that's been put forward is to put conservation on equal footing with some of these other uses on BLM lands and bring better balance to management decisions. So there's sort of three ways the rule aims to do this. There's protect intact landscapes, restore lands back to health, and ensure wise decision-making. And I'll just go through how the plan aims to do these three things in the next couple of slides for you. So first of all, landscape intactness. And this is kind of a no-brainer, right? The BLM needs healthy landscapes to fulfill its multi-use mandate. You're not going to have good rangelands for grazing if you're not tending to the health of those landscapes. And recreationists aren't going to want to hang out hunting, fishing, hiking on lands that are full of noxious weeds, and there's a paucity of wildlife. So these healthy landscapes are really crucial for the BLM to fulfill their mission. And so in the proposed rule, it would be required that BLM identify intact landscapes. And what they mean by intact landscape is an ecosystem that has all the necessary components to be fully functional. And of course, here in Wyoming, we know that we have some of the most intact landscapes left as far as the sagebrush biome. That ecosystem, we have massive tracts of intact landscapes on BLM land in Wyoming. So it's really a big deal for Wyoming, especially. The rule would also require management for ecosystem resilience. So again, in the face of some of these effects from climate change, drought, wildfire, you want to have large tracts of healthy ecosystem, because then when there's, a wildfire in one section, you have plenty of habitat that hasn't been affected, and that ecosystem can be more resilient. And another thing the rule aims to do is apply land health standards to all the lands BLM manages. In the past, land health standards have only been applied to grazing allotments. And it was created in the 1990s, and it requires basic things like presence of stream bank vegetation, adequate canopy and ground cover. And what this rule aims to do is, rather than requiring land health standards just on grazing allotments, it would require it on all the lands BLM manages, which is a huge deal and seems like a really basic thing that the agency should be doing. So that's great. And finally, resource management plans are what will determine what uses are considered compatible with intact landscapes. So the BLM is going to have to identify these intact landscapes, and then during resource management plan revisions, that's when the individual field offices and state office are going to figure out what kind of uses are compatible on those intact landscapes and make sure that those uses are compatible with the conservation values those landscapes provide. And one other thing, Yufna is going to talk more about areas of critical environmental concern when she presents in a minute, but this rule does expand the eligibility criteria for ACECs, which of course are one of the primary protection mechanisms that the BLM has on their lands. So Yufna will tell you a little bit more about that in a couple minutes. All right, so moving on to restoring lands back to health. This is where the BLM is going to aim to address landscape degradation through the following tools and provisions. So one thing is they're going to, if this rule goes forward as drafted, they would require that restoration plans be included in resource management plans. So each field office will have to draft how they're going to be restoring degraded landscapes when they do their resource management plans. The plan would also use mitigation to avoid and minimize impacts from development. And one way to use mitigation would be this new tool, conservation leasing. And I added a few more little notes about conservation leasing because it seems like it's generating a fair amount of interest since this draft rule has been put forward. But conservation leasing would be a mechanism that could be used to restore degraded landscapes or mitigate impacts in one part of a field office. If industry is going forward with development, they could do conservation leasing in another part to sort of offset that development. So conservation leasing would be for restoration, land enhancement, and mitigation. So it wouldn't necessarily be locking up pristine habitat that's untouched to make sure that no other uses can occur there. It's more for restoring and enhancing landscapes to achieve conservation objectives. And it would come in 10-year terms. They can be extended by an additional 10 years, but the BLM hasn't really gotten into how that would work, but they're 10-year conservation lease terms. And they would be subject to National Environmental Policy Act or NEPA requirements and processes, and they would also be subject to bonding requirements. And these leases would be available to any entity that can pay for them, so nonprofits, tribal governments, industry, they all have the option to engage in these conservation leases. And conservation leasing could be a force for restoring degraded lands on a scale that the BLM is just currently unable to achieve. So it could be a really powerful tool. All right, moving on to wise decision-making. This rule wants the BLM to start every decision-making process by asking what is the impact for land health. So just kind of infusing all of those management decisions with the conservation question. And that would look like requiring compliance with land health standards on all BLM lands. I talked about that a little bit before, but again, that would be a great step forward. It would require the BLM to use high quality data to identify priority areas for protection and restoration. And another really important thing, using high quality data, it also would guide the agency to incorporate Indigenous knowledge in their decision-making and use that to help identify high priority areas for protection and restoration. And with that, that's a great segue for me to pass off to my colleague Yufna, who's going to talk a little bit more about that aspect of the rule.
Hi, thanks, Megan. Thanks everybody for being here today. What I'll go over is how this is impacting a lot of what I'm working towards at Wyoming Outdoor Council and the Indigenous Land Alliance of Wyoming. So kind of want to move forward by first saying, and I think Megan really did a great job of explaining what the Federal Land Policy and Management Act is. You'll see a lot of times it being referred to FLPMA. One of the things within my own experience in the past, working with the land and land management was something that this act isn't something we use within tribal management. And so to see that now it's going to be on the same level as conservation and other multi-use on public land is really important. One of the things about it, like I said, is when we talk about multiple use, we mean harvesting, we mean projects with energy, and other projects based upon foraging, recreation, protecting water habitat, and recovery from impacts from droughts, fires, and other land development. So one of the goals for FLPMA is to have a sustained yield by prioritizing the health and resilience of ecosystems across the lands. And then the proposed rule does not prioritize conservation above other uses. It puts conservation on equal footing with the consistent plain use language of FLPMA. So one of the things about that, when we talk about equal footing, for those multiple land uses, but also for traditional ecological knowledge, which is really important to a lot of the work that I'm kind of working towards right now. And like I said, how does this pertain to the work we're doing today? As Megan pointed out, ACECs are areas of critical environmental concern. ILAW and WAC submitted nominations for 2 areas within the Red Desert, which was Boar's Tusk and Indian Gap Trail. We have written support from 2003 from both tribes who consistently want to see protections come from these areas for Boar's Tusk and Indian Gap Trail. I'll also be talking about what co-stewardship looks like inside this proposed bill. If you're able to look at the chat and hopefully push on the link and save the link for later reading. It is a long read, but it is so worth it to see a lot of this language changing towards conservation and traditional ecological knowledge. So these are just proposed ACECs. One of the things for both tribes was back in 2003 requesting that these areas be protected in various ways. And so after all of these types of land management, as far as resource management plan, we're slowly getting to the point where we're hoping to see this come out. But also with this proposed bill that we're asking people to comment on, we'll support smaller things like this at a state level, tribal level. And then also in 2016, WAC did put in ACEC hoback mule deer migration corridor. And within that, we've also resubmitted that to BLM this past December. One of the things about that also is to also protect those corridors and to also move forward in knowing that they will be protected in the future. Those are 2, well, actually 3 ACECs that Wyoming Outdoor Council and Indigenous Land Alliance have submitted. So what is tribal co-stewardship? One of the things in conversations we're having today with the state is talking about what does that definition look like? What do tribal historic preservations see as a benefit from tribal co-stewardship? And what does this look like as far as comments? Like I said, that's within the chat of this long proposed bill. So it's to incorporate language for the proposed policy to define what co-stewardship is. What does it mean to tribes? What does it mean to what does that look like as far as collaboration with conservation NGOs, nonprofits, and then protect the landscapes. We're all working to protect landscapes. That's very vital, as Megan pointed out. Sorry, I keep getting messages. And also to incorporate traditional ecological knowledge, which is also talking about, like I said, that idea of conservation to tribes is traditional ecological knowledge. And then also incorporating greater agreements and inclusion of tribal historic preservation officers, and then find ways to fund tribal projects through nonprofits, MOUs, PAs, MOAs. And so just trying to help facilitate those in ways that we're all on the land and conserving what's important to us. And then again, as Meghan pointed out, set the same standards of TEK knowledge as Western sciences. Like she had pointed out, what does it mean when we look at data? How does that help us? Learning how to protect and preserve these corridors. What does it mean to protect various sites? So that's what this work really means to us on the ground, boots on the ground level, basically. So a lot of people ask me, what is traditional ecological knowledge? And for tribes, it is still what we title as conservation. Plants, animal corridors, water, star knowledge amongst the landscape. And it's not just one site, it's the vast landscape. So what this bill is proposing is to preserve and protect those landscapes. And I believe that's basically all I had. I know we're going to have questions at the end of this, but I'll turn it back over to John and Meghan, and thank you for your time. Thanks.
Wonderful. Yufna, Meghan, huge thank you to both of you for the presentations and just the content there. Meghan, I think you were going to talk a little bit about public comment and how people might be able to be involved. So toss it back to you.
Awesome. Thanks, John. I'll start sharing my screen again. Yeah, and thank you, Yufna. I think the intent with this rule is to really kind of thread more tribal engagement, tribal knowledge, indigenous knowledge into BLM's decision-making throughout. And so that's really encouraging to see. And yeah, we're excited about that component of this proposed rule. All right, and of course, importance of public comments. I know those of you who are WALK members or signed up for our emails may be getting a lot of emails from me asking you to comment on things all the time, but it really is important. And these agencies and entities really do take your thoughts and concerns into their decision-making processes. So I hope that you will all take a moment to add your voice in support of the Conservation and Landscape Health Rule by June 20th. That's the deadline. So we still have a couple weeks. And again, some of the benefits that we anticipate from this rule moving forward would be the fact that it officially puts conservation on equal footing with other uses on BLM lands, which is a huge deal. It would also broaden the eligibility and increase the durability of ACEC protections, which again, those are one of the main protection mechanisms that BLM has to safeguard certain areas. So that sort of broadened eligibility and durability for ACECs would be a huge help for conservation. The rule would increase opportunities for tribal co-stewardship and inclusion of indigenous knowledge. And again, some of the tools, it would scale up the restoration efforts that are possible on BLM lands with that conservation leasing tool. And moving on from the benefits, some other reasons that you might want to public comment is, as I'm sure many of you have seen in the media, there's plenty of opposition already from industry and politicians around this rule, even though it hasn't been finalized. You know, we all still have the opportunity to comment, those of us in the conservation community and those in industry. So, you know, it's still an ongoing process, but, you know, there's plenty of people who are opposed who are voicing their opinion. So this is your chance to provide a counterbalance and tell the BLM what provisions you like. And in addition to that, you also have the opportunity to tell the BLM where they might have opportunities to go further with this rule. I know for my part, I'm probably going to add in my comments that they might want to beef up some of the language around habitat connectivity and yeah, for wildlife. And I'll just say that in one of the virtual meetings that BLM hosted, one of the BLM staffers said, please comment to help us improve the rule. So they really do want to hear from you. And if you have ideas of how it could be even better, great. And if you want to just tell them all the things you love about the rule, that's great too. And as far as how to comment, you can visit the Federal Register and submit your comment online. Hopefully John can drop this link in the chat for me, but this link here takes you direct to where you can comment on this specific rule. Or if you're old-fashioned and don't trust electronics, you can always submit a comment through the mail. And this is the address where you're going to want to send it. And again, your deadline is June 20th, so you have a couple weeks. And again, for those of you who are signed up for emails from WALK, we're going to be sending out an action alert with some tips about what you might want to highlight in public comments, and all of this information will be there. You know, Yufna and I are always available. Feel free to email or call if you have questions and want to talk more about the implications of the rule. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and hand it back to John.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Megan. And for those who haven't looked at the chat, I just dropped that link into the Federal Register. So feel free to take a look at that, which gives you a lot more context and information about the rule. And noting too that we'll be sending out follow-up information with some points and tips on how to comment effectively. We're a little bit ahead of schedule, which is great. It maybe allows for a robust Q&A here if folks have questions that they want to ask Yufna or Megan about some of the content that they just presented on, or other things as well. With 45 people on the call, it's probably going to be easiest actually to type your questions out. So it's hard to monitor that many folks. But I see that there is one hand up right here. That is Larry Wolf. Larry, if you want to unmute and ask your question, that would be great.
Not so much a question. First of all, for everybody on this call, I want to thank all of you. I'm a member of the Outdoor Council board, the treasurer of the board, and the Outdoor Council and our incredible staff we're really pleased to have such a terrific turnout. And I want to thank Yufna and John and Megan and Claire and Alec and everybody else who has worked hard on this, and how important this rule is. We're obviously seeing all of the negative comments, and I hope that we can really formulate some positions that are in fact supportive of this rule. Although I do have one question, which seems to does the BLM realize the irony of saying that they're going to address these concerns in resource management plans, when in fact they're hardly issuing those things?
That is
Megan.
That's a great question, Larry. And I don't know if someone from BLM is on the call and wants to answer that, that would be great. But I know those of us on staff at WALK have been waiting for the Rock Springs Resource Management Plan for a long time. And I think, yeah, there is a little bit of irony. One provision in the rule that is kind of neat, as far as the ACECs goes, is that it would actually stipulate that that they can be designated through the RMP process, but they have to be considered, these new nominations have to be considered in a timely manner, and not just allow the BLM to sit on them and wait until the RMP processes come out. So there is some stronger language for getting around some of these, institutional inertia issues we have with resource management plans taking so long to draft. But you're right, some of this is going to be implemented through resource management plans, and that poses a little bit of a problem when they are long to come to fruition.
Larry, thanks for the good question. Noting another one here in the chat, actually from Adam Goldstein. And Megan, can you see the chat? The question basically is if you could elaborate a little bit. It's actually two questions, one for Yufna, one for you, Megan. Megan, if you could elaborate a little bit on WALK's plans to advocate for bolstered wildlife corridors. What is some of the language that you'd want to see changed?
As far as specific language changes, I'd probably have to check my notes, but it does seem that there's a lot of talk about ecosystem resilience and landscape intactness, without referencing habitat connectivity by name. I know this past November, there was a new instruction memoranda that came out for the BLM to look at habitat connectivity. And there's a lot of good language in there that it would be nice to see spelled out in this regulation, because as you remember from that pyramid of like strength of rules and importance, law, regulation, and then at the bottom is, guidelines and codes. So the instruction memoranda was really more of a guideline. So if we could get some of that language from that habitat connectivity instruction memoranda bumped up and referenced more explicitly in this draft rule, I think that would be great. And as far as how WAC is engaging on bolstering wildlife protections with ACECs, I think that Red Desert to Hoback nomination that was put in 2016 and resubmitted in 2022 are probably where we're putting some of our eggs in that basket.
Gotcha. Thank you, Megan. And then the kind of the follow-up question here in similar vein. Have there been any WAC or iLaw discussions around the designation of the path of the pronghorn as an ACEC or leasing land for conservation within the pathway there?
I think Yufna and I haven't talked about that specifically. I think maybe the issue there is that we don't have a map of, like a modeled map of that pronghorn migration corridor right now. The Wyoming Game and Fish Department is still in the process of drafting it, and there isn't data that's publicly available that shows where that falls on the map. When WAC put in that nomination for an ACEC for the Red Desert to Hoback mule deer migration, there was publicly available data and the map that the Game and Fish had modeled as being the pathway those animals were taking. So it was easy to take that and use it as our guide to put forth a nomination to BLM. I think without a map that the wildlife biologists and subject matter experts have honed and gotten to where they feel good about it, it would be harder, but that might be something that we could explore in the coming months and years.
Yeah, thank you, Megan. Adam, I hope I did your questions justice. If there's any follow-up there, feel free to just unmute yourself and ask. And if not, no worries. Well, great. I'm gonna go to another question here from Amanda. And the question is, Yufna and Megan, can you elaborate on the watershed assessments that they are proposing in the rule? And maybe there needs to be some more context there, which we can ask for. That'd be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding is that I can't remember if it nests in under land health standards or the identification of intact landscapes. It might be under land health standards, but in the past with those land health standards just being assessed by grazing allotment, it was on a pretty small scale. And I believe the intent by coming up with land health standards across all lands that BLM manages is that they would do assessment and evaluation of land health standards on a watershed level. And so that's hopefully what the rule is getting at. But Amanda, if I'm butchering the meaning of your question, let me know. Or if someone else on the call, Alec or Yufna, has more to add, feel free to chime in.
I guess my thing would be is that, you know, those watershed assessments would be done on a national level. And like, you know, they said that they were talking about like, I didn't write it down. Oh, remote imagery, land categorizations, and then local observations and indigenous knowledge was going to be used. So I didn't know if there was any talk about the local knowledge and indigenous information that would be used, and like what resources locally would that entail? Would that include WAC would include conservation districts. Those are the type of things that I didn't know if you guys had discussed.
Yeah, and I think because the rule is still a draft, there are things that might be a little sketchy that the BLM itself hasn't completely fleshed out yet. And that would be a good comment if you're not seeing language that speaks to that, that speaks to, make sure that you're talking to the local tribes, make sure that you're talking with conservation districts at the field office in their jurisdiction. I mean, that's really great to put into a comment that you submit to BLM. I don't know, Yufna, did you have anything to add?
I would say exactly what I would support everything Meghan just had said, because what this land proposal bill is basically asking what else could they do? What are things that they're not looking for, that they're seeing, that they're not seeing? And so when you look at this bill at a national level, each state is going to have different unique asks, right? And so for here in Wyoming, we are really unique in the question that you asked, because not every place has a red desert. Not every place has these areas that are these huge landscapes. So that's a huge, good comment to put into it, because as Meghan has said, BLM is asking us, what do we want? What do we foresee? And how can we make that happen? So I think what you asked is a great question and would be good comment to put into this. Thank you.
Great. Great question, Amanda. Thank you. Next question here is actually from Larry again, and Yufna, it's directed toward you. Just wondering if you could speak more about different examples of tribal co-engagement.
Okay.
Encouraging and that support the effort here.
Okay, yeah. So it kind of goes hand in hand with what Amanda just had asked or made that comment about was what does it look like when we want to pull Indigenous knowledge and look at various landscapes, and how do we pull that data? What does it look like in using that data? And so in my past experience, a lot of times it's hard to get BLM to have tribes be a part of that very first initial process. So getting them out there in the first place is really great, right? So they can kind of figure out what priorities they may have with various parts of the landscape. And then just being inclusive of tribes. There are ancestral tribes that claim Wyoming that aren't within Wyoming. And then the other issue is for tribal stewardship. It's kind of that thing where who is going to help BLM help manage the lands, and then how do you make that on equal footing, right? And so the other part to that is agreements, like I showed on my slides. Does it look like an agreement with the tribes? Different tribes are going to want to do different things, but overall in the end, their goal is to protect, conserve, and preserve various areas. So when we talk about tribal co-stewardship, it really means collaborating with everybody, getting them funding that they may need that they can't get, that BLM is having issues with, or actual stewardship programs where tribal people are going out to these landscapes and helping and reconnecting. So like I said, on a national level, imagine what all of the other states are doing, and then what we're doing here is so much more unique to our own local landscape. So those are the types of things they need to see in these comments, is that how we're so real unique, and what our landscapes are unfenced. They're precious. These need to be protected. So co-stewardship is really just being inclusive of tribes, but how do we get them funding, and what does that look like? And how do we make it work, whether it's the stewardship program, managing water, and then, wildlife. So just being inclusive of that. And it could vary, and it will vary, I think, for various what other tribes may want. I hope that helps. Thank you.
Thank you, Yufna. And then kind of a quick follow-up, because for many of you on the call probably know, in our last newsletter, Yufna has been on the road quite a bit in the last 2 months, including to DC. And Yufna, I'm curious, and Meghan as well, Larry's second part of the question here, do you have a sense of how the administration is responding to the proposed ACECs?
I believe they are in some new areas of language, kind of like what Megan had pointed out earlier. When we went to DC, we met with the Department of Interior and the solicitors. And one of the things that we talked about was, what does this look like going forward? How are we inclusive of conservation and TEK and make it work and have that that standard of level footing with every multiple use that we have out there in the landscapes. And it shouldn't have taken this long for us to get here, but we're here now, right? And so what does that look like going forward? I think it's 50-50 right now. Everybody's excited and everybody's willing to be out there and do this. And then the other part is like, okay, you know, just kind of filling it out and trying to get a sense of what we're actually talking about. And I think that's the reason why we decided to do the conservation cafeteria, was to let people know that this is great, this is something good. And I feel like we're going in a direction that that everybody feels like we're finally at that point where we can protect and conserve these areas. So I think it's great. Megan, do you want to?
Yeah, thanks, Yufna. I think the only thing that I would add is specific to the ACEC nominations that we talked about today that WAC has nominated or submitted in the past years. The 2016 Red Desert to Hoback Mule Deer Migration Corridor ACEC nomination, we know that that got in a while ago, and it has been evaluated as part of the Rock Springs Field Office RMP revision, which we hope to see anytime. So there will be some kind of an evaluation of that nomination included in the draft RMP for Rock Springs when that comes out. As far as the Boar's Tusk and Indian Gap Trail, when we met with the field office in Rock Springs, they said that it was a little bit too recent for those to get included in the RMP that they have ongoing that's supposed to drop anytime now, but that they are in the queue and they will be considering them. And we're going to be continuing our advocacy with that office, meeting with them and continuing to build public support behind those nominations and have a lot of hope for them.
Great. Yufna, Megan, thank you. And Larry, thank you for the good question. It's wonderful to see a question from a former and beloved employee, Ryan Sedgley here. Ryan, you have a great question, and I think we'd all love to see you, see your face if you're available for that, and maybe you can ask your question about NEPA and the expense of it. And if not, I can, no worries.
Yeah, hi everybody. Good to see folks. Yeah, so my question is, NEPA review can cost millions of dollars. It's a very expensive and time-consuming process. Conservation leasing, you know, it's not coming from places with, you know, oftentimes nonprofits that have millions of dollars laying around to do a NEPA review. So is there room for a categorical exclusion, or since Congress has been cutting things out of NEPA recently, is this an area where maybe something like that would make sense?
I think that's a great question, Ryan. And because the BLM is sort of putting forward conservation leasing as a new concept, it's in its infancy. And I think there's a lot of potential for us to sway the agency with our public comments. So that would be a great thing to put in a public comment to BLM. I think as of right now, what I've heard from BLM is that NEPA is going to be part of that conservation leasing. And, you know, one of the entities that's eligible for conservation leasing is industry, right? So they could definitely foot that bill. But you make a great point. If there are nonprofits or tribal governments that want to enter into one of these conservation leases, that would make a lot of sense to try to help them help the landscape by finding some way to defray that cost. So I think that would be an excellent thing to put in a comment to the agency and ask them how they're going to address that.
I'd like to jump in there and answer a little bit of that. My experience with categorical exclusions was a lot in my last job. CADEX projects are very small. CADEX projects are very minimal with they're supposed to meet their own criteria as far as what impacts they're making on the land if it's hasn't been developed. And so categorical exclusions as far as working in the red desert make not too much more sense as far as really leaning towards conservation leases. When you talk about categorical exclusions, as far as including tribal people in the BLM, they already have a process and protocols that they follow. And so when you talk about what does that look like going forward, NEPA does take a long time. So do MOUs, MOAs, and PAs. And so I think really working towards that and understanding, like I've seen categorical exclusions wanting to be approved within 2 years. Even that's a long time, right? So when you talk about MOUs, MOAs, PAs, that could last 4 to 6 years for just tribal people in BLM to approve on something like that. So, which brings me into another thing as far as co-tribal stewardship goes is talking about 638 projects. And what does that look like? And so then that's another conversation. But categorical exclusions are usually small, very tiny, meeting that criteria of impact. So I mean, like, that's a good idea. And that would be a great comment to include. Thank you, Ryan.
Oh, Ryan, thank you so much. Great question. So lovely to see you. Thanks for being on the call. Kind of a higher level question here, Meghan and Yufna. We know these processes and rules can take a really long time to develop. This is maybe really like the highest level, but it's a question Kathleen asked here. How do we help keep these areas that are so precious, safe and protected while this process is ongoing? I wonder if one of you wants to take that.
Yufna, you want to go for it?
Sure. I would just recommend really, we're really relationship built here, right? We kind of, here in Wyoming, we have these really close knit relationships with various people. They're our neighbors or our friends, but they also work in management. And so that's the great thing about Wyoming is that we all kind of know each other and where we work. And it's great to have that relationship building, but also being your own steward and being out there in these areas that maybe a certain area that you may like and that you know of, and just maybe just checking in with BLM once in a while is great. There is a stewardship program that they do have that need volunteers. They do have various programs where they need help. And I would really recommend, even that being a comment in this comment period to really even ask that question, like, what does that look like? Because there are some things that we can work on right now. That's a really great question. Meghan?
I think that's spot on, Yufna. I agree with everything that you said. Yeah, I think being out on the landscape and doing what we can in our own backyard, as Yufna alluded to, there are a lot of stewardship projects you can get involved in. There's a lot of fence modification projects going on over in the Rock Springs field office, Sublette County, both creating fences that are more wildlife friendly, and there's certain fences that need to be raised and lowered seasonally to benefit our ungulates and our sage grouse. So if anyone is interested in that, get in touch with me and I can put you in touch with the organizations that spearhead those efforts.
Great. Thanks, Meghan. Thank you, Yufna. Thank you, Kathleen, for the question. Just noting the time, we have about 5 or so more minutes for questions. So if folks have them, please put them in the chat and we'll try to get to them. Larry, I see a third question here. This one in some ways is actually, I think, really relevant to the political narrative that we're seeing around the rule. There's been a number of op-eds and big pieces in the Casper Star and in other media sources. It's kind of the typical reaction from industry, their perception of this rule, and the perceived kind of conflict that a leasing program or that this rule would have with oil and gas in particular. And just wondering, Yufna or Meghan, if you had any comments on that, if the concern that industry has is legitimate in your mind. If you want to, Larry's question is in here, and Larry, maybe you can ask it too if you don't feel like I did that justice as a summary.
No, you did, you did well. I mean, I think we, both as an organization and then the broader conservation community, need to figure out how we rebut the really predictable reaction, which is, oh, they're gonna steal money that we need to educate the kids, and little Johnny's not gonna have any textbooks. I think I'd like to get your thoughts on, I mean, how do you really think this may work, and realize it's going to take a while for everybody to figure it out, and for a conservation leasing program to develop in its full robustness.
It's a big question. It's an important one. Yeah, Yufna, Megan, if you have any thoughts on that.
I'll go. I just got a little bit to say. So I think that we've always been on that other side as far as wanting a higher quality of land use, right? We've always been on the other side of what does it look like to get to the point where we're protecting these environmental areas that are pristine almost and isolated. And I feel like the values are there. I think that people understand what those values are. And I feel like also the quality of our life here in Wyoming is dependent upon having healthy environments. And I feel like in the end, I always feel rebutting these types of conversations with the other side is honestly, they want to see that too. They want to feel like, they're doing something great, and we're all contributing to something great. And I feel like in the end, I'm hoping that's where we're going. And sustainable living, right, is one goal that I have, not just for everybody else in this landscape, but even for my family. So I feel like whatever that might look like in the future as far as sustainable living is kind of where we're going. And I feel like, everybody kind of is that fear of unknowing of what's going to happen. So, just encouraging people to be like, we need to be a part of this process and submit comments and be a part of that process. So Megan, I don't know if you want to jump in and say anything, but that's all I got to say. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Yufna. I would reiterate what you just said, that, the public comments are open to everyone. And if industry has concerns, they can raise them. I think there is some overreaction happening because conservation leasing, as I think I mentioned, the intent isn't to allow people to lease land and lock out other uses. It's really to do restoration and mitigation work on lands that may be a little bit degraded or that we want to make better for animals and plants that are around there. So yeah, I think there's a misconception about conservation leasing with some folks in oil and gas. And frankly, I think as it stands, existing uses on that land aren't going to be kicked off if someone wants to do conservation leasing there. So an oil and gas company already has a lease. They're not going to be affected by this. It just happens if there's a new conservation lease somewhere that there isn't oil and gas leasing going on, then it might be determined that oil and gas leasing is a non-compatible use on that land. But really, that's almost one of the only uses that would be non-compatible. Grazing can be compatible with a conservation lease, recreation be compatible with a conservation lease. So yeah, there are some industries that might be overreacting a little bit, but if they have concerns, they can avail themselves of the public comment process, the same as the rest of us.
Even Megan, I think that was really well said and really brought a lot of nuance to that. I think a hard question, and one we're going to be really trying to wrestle with and think about as we come up and submit our own comments. Amanda and Tina, noting that seeing your comments here and appreciative of those. It's nice actually to see these comments and what you as members value here. It will help inform how we represent, our conservation interest in Wyoming and our membership and comments that we write in the future. So really appreciate your opinions and comments that you put in the chat here. I'm looking at the time. And let's see, Callie, you have a good question real quick about using the slides and making them publicly available. I think that's something that we've seen thumbs up there from Meghan. We can get you those and we'll actually maybe provide those as resources for follow-up on comments as well. Really just want to thank everybody for the good discussion, the good questions, and the good presentations. So at that, we're at 1 o'clock, the hour here. Everybody, thank you so much. Thank you, Meghan, and thank you, Yufna. And we hope to see you again soon on a conservation cafeteria. Take care, everybody.
Have a good day.
Bye.
John.